There is a story so embedded in Western civilization that questioning it feels like questioning gravity. The Exodus. 600,000 Israelite men, plus women and children, a number that implies a total population of perhaps 2 million people, marching out of Egypt under Moses, crossing the Red Sea, wandering 40 years in the Sinai wilderness, and eventually entering the land of Canaan. It is the foundational narrative of Judaism, the theological backdrop of Christianity, the story referenced more often in American political rhetoric than almost any other ancient text. Presidents invoke it. Civil rights leaders invoked it. It sits at the center of the three largest religious traditions on Earth. And for over a century, archaeologists and historians have been unable to find evidence that it happened, not at the scale the text describes. Not in the Sinai, not in Egypt, not anywhere in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. The silence is not for lack of looking. Archaeologists have been excavating the Sinai Peninsula, the Nile Delta, and the ancient Levant with increasing precision for well over 100 years. Egyptian records from the period the Exodus is traditionally dated, roughly the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, are among the most complete administrative records surviving from the ancient world. The Egyptians documented their grain stores, their building projects, their military campaigns, their border crossings. They recorded the presence of Semitic laborers in the Nile Delta with enough detail to identify their work assignments, and in some cases their names. And nowhere in those records is there any account of a mass departure of hundreds of thousands of people, of plagues that devastated the country, of an army drowned in the sea, of a pharaoh humiliated before his own people by a series of supernatural disasters. The silence of the Egyptian record on the Exodus is not an argument from ignorance. It is an argument from the extraordinary completeness of a record that nevertheless contains nothing. Egyptian scribes of the New Kingdom recorded the rations distributed to foreign workers, the names of overseers, the quantities of mud brick produced on specific days by specific gangs of laborers. They recorded the escape of 2 runaway slaves from the Delta region and the subsequent border patrols sent to recapture them. They recorded a diplomatic letter complaining about the movement of Shazu nomads through the Sinai. If 2 million people had left Egypt in a single organized departure, accompanied by plagues that devastated the agricultural heartland of the Nile Delta, followed by the destruction of a pharaonic army in the sea, the scribes would have written it down. They wrote down everything else. For most of the 20th century, this archaeological silence was treated as a problem of scale and specificity. Perhaps the Exodus happened, but was smaller than the text describes. Perhaps the route was different from the one traditionally assumed. Perhaps the dating was off, and the events should be placed in a different reign, a different century. Scholars proposed the Hyksos, a Semitic people who ruled northern Egypt for roughly a century before being expelled around 1550 BCE, as a possible historical core for the Exodus narrative. They proposed an 18th dynasty date rather than a 19th dynasty one. They proposed routes across the northern Sinai rather than the central or southern routes of tradition. Each proposal generated its own literature, its own evidence, its own counterarguments. None of them resolved the fundamental problem that the scale of the biblical account simply did not appear in any physical record of any period that anyone could identify. And then the ancient DNA arrived and reframed the question entirely. A series of genomic studies conducted between 2014 and 2022, analyzing ancient DNA from individuals buried at sites across the southern Levant spanning the Bronze and Iron Ages, produced a picture of the population history of Canaan that the biblical narrative had not predicted, and that the archaeological silence had not been able to describe. The populations of Canaan during the Late Bronze Age, the period when the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan are traditionally placed, showed a genetic profile that was predominantly derived from the earlier Canaanite Bronze Age population, with a significant additional component of ancestry related to populations from the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. This was the genetic background of the people who would eventually become, in some meaningful sense, the Israelites. And what the DNA showed about the transition from Canaanite to Israelite identity in the archaeological and genetic record was not what the Exodus narrative would predict. There was no sudden influx of a large, genetically distinct population arriving from Egypt. There was no genetic signature of 2 million people who had spent centuries in the Nile Delta, acquiring the genetic characteristics of prolonged residence in Egypt. What there was, instead, was a gradual differentiation of the Levantine population in the highlands of Canaan, a population that was, in its deepest genetic roots, Canaanite, and that over the course of the Iron Age developed the distinct religious and cultural identity that became Israelite. The Israelites, in other words, did not come from Egypt in any simple genetic sense. They emerged, in the genetic record, from the local population of Canaan. This is the finding that reshapes everything, but it does so in a specific and important way. It does not disprove the Exodus. It disproves the Exodus at the scale the text describes. What the genetics cannot rule out, and what a growing number of scholars find increasingly plausible, is a real historical event involving a smaller group, a community of Semitic people who had been in Egypt, who experienced something they understood as a miraculous departure, who carried that memory with them into the Canaanite highlands, and whose story became, through a process of expansion and theological elaboration that is well documented in ancient Near Eastern literature, the foundational narrative of an entire people who were mostly descended from people who had never been in Egypt at all. The Hyksos expulsion provides one possible historical core, a smaller group of Semitic laborers who departed during a period of Egyptian political disruption provides another. The theological power of the narrative was real enough, and the ancient Near Eastern tradition of adopting a compelling origin story as a collective identity marker was well established enough. That neither of these smaller historical events needed to involve 2 million people to eventually become a story about 2 million people. There is a detail in the Egyptian record that the genetics now illuminate in a new way. Among the Semitic laborers documented in the Egyptian administrative records of the New Kingdom, there are individuals with names that appear in the early biblical genealogies. Not many, not proof, but a thread connecting the administrative reality of Semitic presence in Egypt to the narrative that eventually became the Exodus account. The genetics show that the population of Canaan in the Iron Age, the population that becomes Israelite in the archaeological record, carried in its ancestry a component related to the populations of the Nile Delta region. Not at the level 2 million returning slaves would produce, but at a level consistent with a smaller group, absorbed into a much larger local population, contributing a thread of Egyptian-adjacent ancestry that eventually became invisible in the broader Canaanite genetic background, while remaining visible in the cultural and religious tradition, the story left behind. The Exodus is not a story that the genetics can confirm. It is a story that the genetics can no longer simply dismiss as pure invention. Somewhere in the gap between 2 million people and no people at all, there is a real historical event. An event small enough to leave no clear mark in the Egyptian administrative record, small enough to be genetically invisible in the population of Iron Age Canaan, without careful modern analysis, but large enough in its human meaning to become the most retold story in the history of Western civilization. The people who carried it were not necessarily the ancestors of everyone who eventually claimed it, but they carried something real. A memory of departure, of water, of wilderness, of a covenant made in a place with no landmarks, that was too powerful and too specific to have been invented entirely from nothing. There is a question this raises that the genetics cannot answer, but that the genetics make unavoidable. If the Exodus happened at a fraction of the biblical scale, and if most of the Israelite population was in fact Canaanite in origin and had never been in Egypt, then what was the nature of the process by which a small group's experience became an entire people's identity? The answer may be the most important thing the Exodus story actually tells us. Not about ancient Egypt or ancient Canaan, but about how human communities construct the stories they need in order to become what they are trying to become. This is not a uniquely Israelite process. The Romans constructed an origin story involving Trojan refugees and she-wolves and divine ancestry that bore little relationship to the actual genetic and historical origins of the Latin people. The Greeks traced themselves to heroes and gods whose existence was poetic rather than biological. Every people that has ever formed a coherent identity has done so in part by choosing which stories to tell about where they came from, and those choices were never purely historical. They were always, simultaneously, theological and political and psychological. The Israelite case is not different in kind, it is different in consequence. Because the story that was constructed in the highlands of Canaan in the Iron Age, whatever its historical core, proved to be the most durable narrative technology in the history of Western civilization. It unified a population of diverse Canaanite origins around a shared memory of liberation that most of them had never personally experienced. And it worked so completely that by the time the Hebrew scriptures reached their canonical form, the story had become the identity, inseparable from the people who carried it forward. The genetics are now showing us both the limits of the story and the magnitude of what it accomplished. And those two things together are, in their own way, more remarkable than the story at face value ever was. The Exodus did not happen the way the text says it happened, but something happened. And whatever that something was, it was large enough in its human meaning to become the foundation of three of the world's great religions, to be invoked by enslaved people seeking freedom, by colonists declaring independence, by civil rights marchers crossing a bridge in Alabama. A story that powerful does not come from nothing. The DNA is telling us it did not come from 2 million people either. It came from somewhere in between, from a real experience carried by real people into a world that needed exactly the story they had to tell.